What's up, y'all? Ty. We're going to be reacting to Thinking Basketball and talking about Russell's statistical case over Wilt. Now, look. Wilt Chamberlain is my GOAT, okay? And I think he was better than Bill Russell. So, I'm eager to hear why he thinks Bill Russell's statistical case over Wilt. I'm eager to hear this because I don't think he has one. But shout out to Thinking Basketball. The link to his channel will be down below in the description.
LeBron James is the greatest player ever. I don't ever want to hear anybody
Get your coffee out, man, for this one.
that he is number one.
Michael Jordan is number 2.
He just can't stand it.
The greatest of all time. The GOAT debate.
Whoa! I just saw a top 5 without Wilt.
The greatest of all time. The GOAT debate. It dominates the conversation today, but the original GOAT debate captivated basketball back in the 1960s. Back then, the hoops world was divided into two camps. One side argued for Wilt Chamberlain, based on his outlying statistical achievements, and the other for Bill Russell, who collected an astounding 11 championship rings.
Because of his
But
teammates.
what if that whole paradigm is backwards? What if we threw Russell's rings out the window, used Wilt's stats against him, and made the statistical case for Russell over Chamberlain?
Coffee is so hot, man.
You are watching what greatness is all about.
Where's Larry Bird in all this?
Has it blocked by Elijah Wan. Michael Jordan saves the day.
This series tackles one question: who was the best at his best? We start at the ABA merger and go through the best multi-year stretches, examining the legends who provided the most on-court impact. These are the greatest peaks.
Wilt.
Before we dive into specific years and criteria, we'll do that at the end of this episode, Wilt and Russell illustrate something at the heart of this series and basketball itself. In 1962,
What,
Chamberlain
competition?
famously averaged 50 points and 25 rebounds per game while playing every minute of every game.
Y'all know he just dunked on Bill Russell.
Many consider it to be the most dominant season in NBA history. I don't think it's one of the 100 best seasons. That may sound crazy, but those 50 points came with a lot of caveats. For one, there were way more scoring chances back in 1962.
I get it. But if you want to sit there and slander Wilt for that, why did nobody else average 50?
Teams ran up and down to the tune of about 130 possessions per game. That's about 30 more chances to rack up stats than in a typical game today. More shots, more free throws, rebounds, and so on.
Here we go.
We examined this stat inflation last year, but the takeaway here is that 50 points per game then isn't what we'd think of as 50 points per game in the three-point era. Maybe the easiest way to see this is to note that Wilt scored about 40% of his team's points that season while he was on the court, whereas Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant scored about 43% of their team's points when on the court during their mega-scoring seasons. Wilt also played the entire game, which gave him a few extra minutes of impact, but also made his rate of scoring less impressive.
Okay, let me ask you this, though. Wilt is 7'1". How many 7'1" players nowadays play every minute of every game, including overtime? 0. Like, he's an Iron Man. Like, and you're trying to slander him. Like, what?
The Dipper scored about 29 points every 75 possessions he played that year, which would rank 7th this season, so a huge number, but not
Now you're comparing this season to way back then. Funny. Okay, so let me ask you this. Why this year do we have so many players averaging over 30 and nobody over 40 if everything is somewhat close? And in that season, it wasn't close. Why? Do you have an answer for that?
historical outlier.
I don't like this.
Okay, but so what, you might say? Even with stat inflation, Wilt still crushed Russell as a scorer, right? And he did. Russell's scoring rate was actually below league average for most of his career. But the question here isn't who scored more points per game.
Who is better?
It's how much did these players help their teams score more efficiently. Playmaking is the other enormous driver of offensive
impact. And guess what? When you have John Havlicek, sure, you better average more assists.
Making life easier for all four of your teammates, not just yourself. And Wilt Chamberlain was the original black hole. It wasn't that he couldn't pass or that he never set up his running mates, it's that he very rarely set them up relative to how much he shot. If we
Because he played with nobody.
look at true shot attempts, that is, when a player took a field goal or attempted 2 free throws, and compare those scoring attempts to assists, we can see just how little Wilt was playmaking. Here are all the
Because his teammates couldn't hoop.
seasons since the shot clock, with at least 20 true shot attempts per 75 possessions. Now here's Wilt in the first half of his career. He scored more while passing less than just about anyone ever, and that was a criticism of him at the time. It was common to hear refrains like this from Sports Illustrated in 1966. But the tactical demands of using Wilt to his best advantage, that's scoring by the way, severely diminish his team's own versatility and generally create morale problems among those who want the ball as much as he does. Now,
They don't have anybody who can hoop, though.
let's go back to that graph and add his 50 points.
Talk about the team he had.
It is an outlier among outliers. This has been hiding in plain sight for 60 years. And the names of those who have even gone over 15 to 1 should drive home just how one-dimensional his offense was.
Look what happened in his later careers when he had teammates. Didn't he average 9 assists? That's what I thought.
The only players to cross
That's what I
that
thought.
threshold in the last decade were Brook Lopez in Brooklyn and Kristaps Porzingis in 2018. The takeaway here is that Wilt's sexy scoring numbers were mostly one-dimensional, and there's only so much you can help your team without making life easier for teammates. Because of that NBA axiom, Chamberlain's team's offenses weren't very good during those volume scoring seasons. They were most efficient in 1962, scoring about 2 points more per 100 than league average.
I don't like this guy. He's so one-sided in this argument. How about you argue for Wilt, okay? You literally argue over his case over Wilt. Yeah, because Wilt had no teammates. You put Wilt on that Boston team, guess what's going to happen?
But every other season they were around average, with Chamberlain registering huge numbers. In 1965, his team had the worst offense in the league by a mile before he was traded, and Wilt averaged 39 points per game on solid efficiency that year.
Because his team was horrible, once again.
Pattern has actually held throughout NBA history. Huge volume scoring doesn't guarantee a good offense. It can help.
Oh yeah, who'd Allen Iverson have on that team? You want to remind me? Thinking basketball, did he have a lot of other talent on that team or no? Okay, what about what do I think? Luka missed the playoffs last year. You want to know why? Because he didn't have a lot of talent around him. Like,
Lift
come on,
teams
man.
to
What are we
competitive
talking
levels,
about?
raising their floor, if you will. But there are endless combinations of talent that can make an NBA offense slightly below average, besides dumping it into an isolation score 40% of the time. In 1965, Wilt was traded to the Philadelphia 76ers for their 5th and 8th man, and Philadelphia improved from around 500 play to about a 48-win pace. We don't know how much of this improvement was a much-needed defensive boost, but again, big scoring alone didn't create a good offense. Wilt's team offenses actually improved when he finally shot less. Way less, actually.
You want to know why? Because he had a lot more talent. That's really what it revolves around. When you have more talent around you, you can have a bigger impact on the game because you can pass the ball, you can do all these things. Where if you don't have talent, what are you supposed to do?
Players in NBA history have downshifted so severely as a scorer, going from a shooting machine to leading the NBA in assists. In his second full season with the 76ers, Wilt's scoring rate dropped almost down to Russell levels, and his team's offense exploded. There's an enormous negative correlation between Chamberlain's scoring rates and his team's offensive success.
And that's
the less
just
he shot,
fine.
the better they did. That doesn't mean his volume shooting hurt his team, but it does suggest that it was holding back his better teammates.
Yeah, because he had a lot of good teammates back then.
Otherwise, why did his coach completely change his style with better players around him?
Because he had better players around him. That's why they changed the style.
Russell, on the other hand, was never seen as an offensive force, but instead is the benefactor of great teammates.
Thank you. Bring up the teammates.
Kuzi and Heinsohn at first, then Sam Jones and
Jones.
Havlicek.
You give Wilt Sam Jones, see what happens.
There's an enormous problem with that idea. If there's one thing that hasn't changed in the NBA over the years, it's that most all-star players are recognized for their offense. This includes those Celtics around Bill Russell, and it's often said that his bandmates made Boston a dynasty. But the Celtics weren't actually overflowing with all-star talent then. Here are the all-star appearances by team during Boston's perfect run from 1959 to 1966, excluding Russell and Wilt. Does any club jump out as being completely stacked with all-stars if Wilt or Russell were to join them? If anything, the Lakers, behind Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, two of the 5 best players of the period themselves, look like the most top-heavy team. If we add Russell to the Celtics, they end up with the most all-stars, but Wilt's teams weren't lagging far behind. So a bunch of franchises had 2 or 3 all-star players, typically based on offensive play, and since Russell's...
I hate that whatever statistic he just brought up. Tell me who the all-stars were, what they averaged, what their efficiency was like, instead of just using statistics. Hate that. There's different levels of all-stars too.
Supporting cast was no different. It should come as no surprise that Boston's offense was around average or even below average for most of the 1960s. Instead, those Celtics teams won with defense. During Russell's time in Boston, he spearheaded the greatest defensive dynasty the league has ever seen, strangling opponents night after night with a timeless combination of size, speed, mobility, and awareness. Boston ultimately incorporated solid defensive teammates to platoon around Big Bill, but he was the driving force behind...
I'm not going to sit there and act like he defensively wasn't.
...club that allowed the fewest points per possession in the league in 11 of his 13 seasons. And while most of the NBA was struggling to reach 50 wins at the time due to parity, Russell's Celtics were an outlier, cranking out 60-win seasons. These circles represent every team's defensive efficiency relative to the league since 1955. The year before Russell arrived, Boston had the worst defense in the league statistically, giving up an estimated 3 points more than league average. With Russell, they jumped to the top of the league and would steadily improve as 1950s names faded and were replaced by stronger and more athletic defenders in 1961.
Look at the big jump,
At their
though.
peak in 1964, Boston was nearly 10 points better per 100 than other teams on that end, arguably the greatest defensive season ever. As Russell aged and the NBA expanded, Boston remained competitive with its defense until he retired at 35 and then immediately fell back to the pack.
Like I said, defensively, I'm not going to sit here and debate that.
All told, Russell captained 5 of the 25 best defensive seasons in league history in a row, an unrivaled team accomplishment. Without a three-point line and primitive spacing that allowed big men to patrol the paint as a backstop, a versatile vertical defender like Russell became the game's most valuable weapon. Boston's ascension to record-setting defense coincided with Russell playing more minutes with a platoon of players around him.
The thing that I think is just so flawed is it's like you're comparing. Just compare the Celtics team to the teams Wilt was on in that
Apex,
era.
no other Celtic logged more than 33 minutes per night, and Boston's final resurgence in 1969 came with Russell re-upping his minutes alongside Boston's best offensive player at the time, John Havlicek. Many
So
people
good.
talk about Wilt dominating Russell heads up because he scored more than Bill. In their 142 meetings on record, Chamberlain averaged over 28 points per game on 51% true shooting, compared to just 14 points per game on 42% true shooting.
Come on, dog. He shot 42% and 14 points. The game, it's not even close.
Russ. But Russell's primary value didn't come from his scoring. He won 5 MVPs because he made scoring harder for the opposition, and Chamberlain was no exception. Against everyone else, Wilt averaged 34 points per game on 54% true shooting, so Russell gave him a major haircut.
I mean, you'd expect that from the best defensive player of all time, right? Like, you'd expect that.
Denting his scoring and efficiency,
still was
you might
decent.
think, sure, but Wilt's numbers are still great. But remember, his scoring didn't make his team's offense very potent in the first place. So Russell was blunting what was only a moderately sharp weapon to begin
You know
with.
what? I'm gonna take a pause, okay? Because this guy is making me mad. Okay, I gotta take a pause here because it's making me mad. Like the way he's just slandering Wilt Chamberlain. This is Wilt Chamberlain's team. Okay, in one of his seasons. Okay, his second leading scorer. You guys probably heard of him. Let me find out. Okay, per game. Second leading scorer was Paul Arizin. Okay, the third leading scorer was Tom Gola, Guy Rogers, Al Addles. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing comparing that team to the Celtics team? And next year, he doesn't even have the next year. He's without his second leading scorer. He's gone. It's like Paul Arizon's gone. It's like what is Wilt supposed to do?
With imparting that massive defensive impact that drove Boston to title after title every spring. And when Chamberlain was going hog wild trying to score in 1962, Russell gave him a larger haircut. In these 75 games, Wilt didn't face Bill. He averaged 51 points per night on 54% true shooting. Against Russell, he averaged 37 points per game on 50% true shooting.
Yes, I'm not going to argue Wilt was better when he played Bill Russell. It's not what I'm not arguing that Wilt leveled up his game. I'm saying he was still in their matchups the better player.
11th this year in permanent scoring, similar to Paul George in volume and efficiency. If there were stats like opponent field goal percentage in the paint, or how much did you hold players below their average, pundits might have viewed Russell's performances against Wilt as being dominant. But those stats didn't exist, so Russell's continued success forced people then to search for explanations beyond scoring. Some people like to credit his intangibles as a leader, and others are more dismissive.
Let me ask you this. What did Bill Russell average for points, and what did he shoot true shooting goal percentage? Okay, awesome. Take those stats versus Wilt Chamberlain. When he played Wilt Chamberlain, I bet they're down. You can't do this for one side and then not do it for the other side. That's the problem I have with this argument. Okay, sure, Wilt wasn't maybe as efficient against Bill Russell. Do you think Bill Russell was as efficient against Wilt?
Looking to his teammates as the reason for their success. We don't have precise measuring tools for that period, but if we look at the 28 games Russell missed,
look at the guys he's got on this team: Sam Jones, Tom Sanders, John Havlicek, Casey Jones. You've heard of all of those guys. Bob Cousy, Tom Eitzen. Come on, what are we talking about?
1958 and 1969, the Celtics played at a 35-win pace without him and a 59-win pace when he played. That's super duper impact,
that is,
especially compared to the changes we saw when Wilt shifted teams. But remember, these are crude measuring tools. Another more comprehensive approach is to also account for teammates who have gone in and out of the lineup over the years by looking at how his teammates impacted teams when they were in and out of the lineup, and so on and so forth. We did something just like this in part 5 of the Thinking Basketball Stats series. And when we solve this giant equation to estimate a player's overall value, looking at just the final score and who played in the game, Russell comes out ahead of Wilt. This is a noisy calculation. It's possible that in reality,
I like that stat though.
These players could be worth a few points more or a few points less per game than these studies conclude. But consider how amazing this is. The only thing this metric uses is who played and what the score was. And yet, its top 25 players claimed 3/4 of the available MVPs and averaged...
like I said, I like this stat. Is that Paul Pierce?
13 all-star appearances per player.
I'm a see my
And again,
I see my
it
way
says
out.
that when we ignore
Paul
the
Pierce
box score and focus on the relationship between the scoreboard and the player, that Bill Russell is actually better than Wilt Chamberlain. That's incredible to me, even if it's not a definitive proof, and all of this has significant ramifications for the idea of number one options. We typically think about them as the best offensive player on a team, but a great defender like Russell can be the best player on his team by far without being the best or even second best offensive player. This was often the norm before the ABA-NBA merger in 1977, and while it's rare today because rule changes have helped elite offensive players while chipping away at elite defensive impact,
true.
Tim Duncan's Spurs, Kevin Garnett's Celtics, and arguably Ben Wallace's Pistons are examples of recent teams where the best overall player wasn't head and shoulders the best offensive player. If we return to those impact studies that looked at who played and what the score was, we see something fascinating. Among the top 20 players, a handful are primarily playmakers, a handful are primarily scorers, who are also plentiful playmakers, and another handful are defensive titans. What's so telling to me is that this metric isn't influenced by any of our ideas of scoring, first and second options, or even
why do I see Paul Pierce?
defense, and yet it's littered with at least 4 completely different types of players. If we use modern play-by-play data to generate a more stable look at this kind of scoreboard-only impact, again, we'd see the exact same results hold. It's a player's overall impact that matters in basketball, and that comes in so many different combinations. In many ways, Wilt and Russell are the original example of this philosophical loggerheads, with Chamberlain bringing offensive and defensive impact, and Russell trying to outpace him, mostly with his giant defensive value. Isolation scoring, like Chamberlain's, can be impressive to watch, and helpful for teams starved of scoring threats, but it can also prevent other offensive talents from flourishing in the absence of playmaking.
Who on his team could flourish without Wilt?
That means I'll be working off the following criteria for this series. First, this series is about basketball impact on the court. We'll contextualize circumstances and philosophies, but factors like aesthetic appeal are outside of the scope here. Second, I care about someone's overall impact, specifically how much they can help a team win championships. That means skills that scale up to better teams tend to matter more than skills that can't mesh with other top flight players.
That'd be cool, but Wilt literally won a championship.
Third, we're starting in 1970.
Like, after Bill got out of there and after, the Celtics didn't have a super team and after Wilt had some talent, then guess what happened?
When the leagues merged. While the game continues to evolve, the size of the league and its competitiveness are similar since the merger, making for fair comparisons, which will be made relative to the league in a given year. There are no time machines here. Instead, we're trying to understand how much a player impacted the game given the rules and practices of that time. And finally, those peaks must contain multiple consecutive seasons. The key reason for this approach is to avoid fluky single-season outcomes and to increase the breadth of information to evaluate.
This is all fine, but Wilt
at the end
is
of the
still
series,
my
we'll
GOAT.
revisit how all these guys stack up, but otherwise the episodes will flow run NBA history. If you're interested in Thinking Basketball, the book, and Chronicle...
I'm telling y'all right now, he brought up some good points. Got me thinking a little bit. But I just think it's so unfair because Wilt did not have the talent that Bill Russell had. So for Bill, what if he was on a team that needed some more offensive punch? I'm going to leave you with that. Drop a like on the video, subscribe if you're new, and as always, man, I love you guys. Have a blessed day.